Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 251 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. What did early Americans think about science? And how did they pursue and develop their knowledge of it? Today, many view science as a practical intellectual pursuit, the systematic study of how the physical and natural world work. We mostly see science as a broad field of professional study where scientists in all sorts of different labs conduct experiments and make observations that tell us something new. Is this how early Americans viewed science? As a field practiced by professional scientists in all sorts of different labs, conducting experiments that could tell them something new? Cameron Strang, an assistant professor of history at the University of Nevada, Reno, joins us to investigate the world of early American science and natural knowledge making. Using details from his book, Frontiers of Science, Imperialism and Natural Knowledge in the Gulf South Borderlands, 1500 to 1850, Cameron reveals how early Americans understood science and natural knowledge between 1500 and 1850, information about the different types of people who undertook acts of scientific inquiry and how they understood those acts, and details about the ways in which imperialism both furthered and hindered scientific inquiry. But first, thank you. I really appreciate how you join me each week and consider our guest scholars' ideas about the early American past. I think it's a lot of fun to discover and think about how and why people acted as they did and why events happened as they did, and all of this discovery is made even more fun because we do it together. I'm also grateful for how you tell others about the show. The listenership of Ben Franklin's World keeps growing because you take the time to tell others about the podcast. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. And please, continue your great work of spreading the word about the show. All right, are you ready to venture into the early American world of science and see how early Americans developed their scientific knowledge? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is an assistant professor of history at the University of Nevada, Reno. His research interests take him into the worlds of science, Native America, and into the early North American borderlands. He's the author of prize-winning articles and a book, Frontiers of Science, Imperialism and Natural Knowledge in the Gulf South Borderlands, 1500 to 1850. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Cameron Strang.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, in Frontiers of Science, Cameron seeks to show us how early American peoples produced knowledge and the different ways they contributed to scientific knowledge production. And he does this by taking us on the ground into the Gulf South borderland region to show us these things at work. Cameron, before we venture into the early American Gulf South, would you tell us about some of the terms that you used in Frontiers of Science? Specifically, how do you define the Gulf South, and how do you define what you call natural knowledge? Is that something that's different from science?
Absolutely. So, first of all, to take the question about the Gulf South, in present-day terms, it's basically the region from East Texas to Florida. And I picked this region in part because these were all places that were not part of the, original 13 colonies that have been the subject of so much attention for historians, and especially intellectual historians of early America. And I also picked it because this was really the first place in what's now the United States to experience colonialism, beginning in the early 1500s in Florida with the Spanish, and then later with the French in Louisiana, and then the British become involved. And this era of imperialism really defining what happened in this region would last for the next well over 300 years at least. In terms of natural knowledge, this basically means knowledge that human beings produce about the natural world. And this obviously includes a lot of the same things as scientific knowledge, knowledge about things like plants and animals and people and stars and lands and rivers. But I like this term natural knowledge because while it includes what we think of now as science, it's not entirely limited to it. It also includes other forms of knowledge, especially those practiced by natives and people of African descent, that that don't fit so easily with modern conceptions of science or conceptions of science at the time either. So by choosing this term natural knowledge, I hope to do a more inclusive history, one that is able to engage with the history of science, but also to see that history as part of a larger intellectual milieu.
Speaking of this more inclusive science, when we talk about natural science production or natural knowledge production between 1500 and 1800, who are we talking about as the producers of this knowledge?
There certainly were many people who, both then and now, would be really easily recognized as men of science, people who went about studying the natural world in systematic ways that would have been acceptable to elites in places like London or Paris as scientific. But these were by no means the only people doing this. Not only were there diverse Indians and African descended peoples studying nature in ways that dealt with manipulating plants or identifying new places or identifying new resources, a lot of the same kinds of topics that Europeans were also engaged with, but also through epistemologies that wouldn't have been always made complete sense to Europeans who were then, interested in creating boundaries to science as a way to sort of legitimize what they were doing as more authoritative than what, say, natives were doing to study nature.
So could you give us an example of how Native Americans in the Gulf South understood and conveyed natural knowledge, and how that understanding may have differed from the ways that Europeans understood and conveyed natural knowledge?
Sure. So one of my favorite examples from the book is the case of a man named Yaolechi, a Creek Indian who claimed to have discovered a mineral deposit in Florida. And during the course of this expedition, in which he's leading two Spaniards to go find this supposed deposit of silver, he ends up really embedding his account of this in recognizable Creek stories that have been told into the 20th century even, specifically about this big monster lizard. For one, I think this is interesting in that these kinds of facts, right, these things like the existence or non-existence of metal, would be contextualized in these stories and the social relationships that those stories make clear. And this is something that science at the time was really trying to stop doing. It was trying to isolate facts from social and narrative contexts while these indigenous stories were fully embedding in it. And what I think was really fascinating about this event, other than the monster, which is fascinating in of itself, is that the Europeans who were supposed to be organizing this and really saw themselves as men of science were also unable to really detach the mineralogical knowledge of the expedition from these narrative contexts that these European pretensions really about being able to dissect nature and take apart what they found useful from what they found extraneous really broke down in the borderlands.
Cameron, I think we need to hear more about this story of the monster lizard and this expedition you're talking about.
Sure. So the monster lizard story, there's several different examples of it. And it seems to have been told by several different native groups throughout the Gulf South. And the basic gist is that a group of hunters go off explicitly in search of esoteric knowledge, right? Looking for special plants that are going to give them exceptional powers. In the course of this expedition, though, they run into this giant monster lizard who they describe as, glittering silver, impervious to bullets, and has breath that can attract prey into its mouth. By breathing, it brings flying eagles into its mouth, and people as well. And all but one of these hunters ends up getting eaten. The other one goes back. In some accounts, they're able to bring some kind of specialized magic into defeating the lizard. In a lot of accounts, the lizard wins. So it's an interesting story. Like a lot of native stories from the time, it doesn't have a kind of satisfying moral, like from a European storytelling tradition tend to think of as normal. So in the case of this expedition, which was organized in 1790 to go try to find this mineral deposit, which I think is right near what's now Ichituckney Springs, a really interesting site in Central Florida. The two Spaniards who went with Yaolechi, the Creek Indian, also claimed that when they got to the place where the minerals were supposed to be, that they saw this monster. And when they went back and reported this to the treasurer of St. Augustine, who had sent them out on this expedition, they really narrated themselves as if they were hunters in this classic monster story. That they talk about how they stalked up to the beast's cave, they got within sight of it, that it was glittering and stalking about, and there were bones of dead animals all around it. And then they say that they ran away and were unable to verify whether or not there were actually these precious metals there. And then when they get back to St. Augustine, the treasurer who sent them out, this very learned guy, not only insists that there were in fact precious metals there, but he goes on to write a kind of Linnaean taxonomy of this beast that was basically defined through this native story. We often like to look at the past as if there are these clear distinctions between European science and Indian knowledge or something. And when you get into the nitty-gritty of these case studies in the borderlands, I find these break down a lot in really interesting ways.
So if there weren't any clear distinctions between European science and native knowledge in this instance, were there any lessons that the Creeks and Spaniards took about the natural world from this expedition? And would their lessons have differed in any way because of their different cultural backgrounds?
They did bring back some of the specimens and such that we often associate with scientific expeditions. They brought back sarsaparilla, which at the time was a valuable commodity, and they were happy to know that existed. One of the expedition members brought back some samples of gold, but it was really kind of sketchy how he presented this. He showed it about 2 weeks after they got back, but it's pretty doubtful whether he actually found any of that during the expedition, because not least of which is not really much gold in the middle of Florida. But I think what was really learned from this more was political knowledge than scientific, that in the course of trying to plan another expedition, what the folks in charge, the governor of Florida, basically decided that it wasn't worth it, that even if there were gold or silver in these mines, that going to them would actually upset the Creeks enough that this could bring down war on Spanish Florida and lead to disaster. It's a really sort of instructive moment that we tend to think that European empires always have the power to go and study geography or minerals and extract wealth from them. But in Spanish Florida, at least, they recognized that they did not have the power to do this, that what was more important was keeping the Creeks happy, because if the Creeks got mad, then they would cease being a buffer to the United States, and that this really tenuous colony could get wiped out. So again, this example makes us think about imperial science a little bit differently. This isn't a situation where empires could always sort of call the shots as to what they learned or how they learned it, that they had to function within these geopolitical realities in which sometimes they were not the lead player.
Was this how knowledge production happened in the Gulf South? Mostly through these expeditions that placed Native Americans and Europeans in a position where they had to exchange knowledge? Is that how a lot of science and natural knowledge was produced and perhaps negotiated in the early Gulf South?
It was both. There were many expeditions, and a lot of these expeditions during the Spanish era and later into the US era were organized locally, like governors in places like New Orleans or St. Augustine would send out expeditions, give them written instructions about what they were supposed to find, and report back to them. And if these proved interesting enough, then they get reported to scientific institutions or the court in Madrid or in institutions in places like Philadelphia. But there are definitely other ways of producing knowledge beyond these expeditions. Individuals, fast forwarding a little bit to the 1830s, a lot of planters would use their own slaves, say, to acquire natural history specimens that they could then analyze themselves and then send off to places like the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia as a way to, build relationships with Eastern scientists and end up, in the case of some of these planters, actually patronizing other scientific expeditions that would bring naturalists from places like Philadelphia down to the Gulf South. So yeah, there were lots of different contexts in which knowledge was created. But the big theme of the book in a lot of ways is that the overarching context of this is imperialism, that this is the thing that more than anything else conditions how knowledge is produced from really the 1500s up through the mid 1800s.
Now, when you say imperialism, do you mean the rivalries between the different players of empire in North America, which were actually quite numerous because you don't just have the European empires, but many Native American empires as well? Is that what you mean by imperialism, is these rivalries?
Yeah, so that's part of it. So when I'm talking about imperialism, what I'm really most interested in is the set of encounters that imperialism produces. And geopolitical competition is definitely one of these. What I found to be the most interesting one, and the one that affects knowledge, throughout early American history and one that's really gotten very little attention, is violence. That, with imperialism comes not only military conquest and torture and such of natives for information, but it also leads to the establishment of plantations in which violence is used to not only extract labor, but to force enslaved people to, say, do agricultural experiments and this kind of thing. And violence also occurs, in more sort of day-to-day ways during these scientific expeditions like we were talking about. For example, there was a large astronomical expedition to run the boundary between Spanish Florida and the United States in the late 1790s. And in this, they were able to actually do the physical labor of running this boundary by exploiting enslaved Black laborers. But they were ultimately stopped from actually completing their survey because of the threat of violence from native groups who still called the shots in a lot of the region. So violence both enables and circumscribes the pursuit of science in this region. And it's just one of these encounters created by imperialism that I think really has to be understood to understand how knowledge is and is not produced throughout early America.
These are really interesting finds, Cameron, and I wonder if you could tell us more about how enslaved people participated in scientific experimentation and in producing natural knowledge. Did their participation lead to any different contributions to knowledge and science, or to any new knowledge in science?
Yes, and similar to these other groups, right, that there's no one way, that there's so many diverse African groups. But I do think that in America, at least, and it probably holds true for other parts of the Americas, but maybe not so much for Africa itself, within the Americas, knowledge is, even more so than these other groups, I think, defined by a context of violence and really unequal power relations that come about with imperialism, that the kinds of knowledge they pursue and the ways in which they're able to pursue it are really hemmed in by this plantation world. There's an example I explore in the book of 4 enslaved individuals in Louisiana who get caught up in this slave poisoning conspiracy when they were trying to poison one of their Black overseers. And it's this really fascinating example in which newly arrived Africans who are seen as these experts on what they call the drugs of the country are being hired by local Creoles and provided with kind of substitute ingredients by these local Creoles, for example, alligator parts instead of crocodile parts, to try to produce these substances that they're calling gree-gree. And throughout it all, it's just so unclear of whether the people who are producing this think that they're actually making a poison or think that they're making some kind of other force endowed object, that gree-gree can mean all kinds of different things. And that the ability to actually peer into this world of African expertise in America and how this was created and employed, it's really challenging because the few glimpses we have often do come from these court trials, and the individuals involved, all say very different things of what they're actually doing. And there's not a lot of written records, obviously, coming from the people themselves. So I guess the most I could say there is that the kind of knowledge pursued by Africans in the New World is similar to that of all of these other groups in the sense that it's very much contextualized and conditioned by this world of imperial violence and imperial competition, but that it's even harder to sort of glimpse the details of it because there's just so many different moving parts. There's Creoles with their own visions. There's newly arrived Africans who, for their words to even be captured takes 2 layers of translation. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So thus far, we know that culture impacted views of science and knowledge, and that science and imperialism typically went hand in hand with each other. Cameron, how did these different elements impact the information that different groups wanted to collect? Like, what types of knowledge were people in the early Gulf South interested in finding and collecting?
So there's all kinds of knowledge, and some of this is seen as directly useful for imperialism. Some of it is not. In terms of what is considered necessary to, say, U.S. expansion, things like astronomy that can use observations of the heavens to make exact geographical descriptions of Earth, which leads to good maps, which leads to not only being able to stake more formal claims, but to be able to do these cadastral surveys in which Anglos occupy this land and use that land to dominate Black folk. But there's also all kinds of knowledge pursued through reasons that fit more in the category of curiosity. People who are studying geology and ancient fossils, this doesn't really have a direct supporting U.S. expansion or the expansion of any other empire. But I think, the ways that, say, geology is done very much hinge on these same imperial contexts. I hope that this makes people think about the overarching context of early American science a bit differently. That for the longest time, the big context has been the post-independence context of liberty and democracy, really setting the terms for how science would be pursued in America. And my real big point here is that there's not this huge break with 1776, that in fact, imperialism continues to be the defining context for the vast majority of North America, both before and after independence.
One of the ideas that we keep coming back to in this conversation is that imperialism and imperial violence facilitated science. And earlier, Cameron mentioned that Spain and the United States conducted an astronomical survey to settle the border between their two territories. And I think this is a story that we should hear more about, because I think it's a story that will really help us better see this relationship between imperialism and science. So that's what we're going to do, right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. Wow. If you really think about it, we tend to think of early American science as occurring in museums and universities. But Cameron's research on how American scientific thought developed really brings us into the world to show us how Indian sages, African slaves, and Spanish officials, plus many other people in the frontier, also produced natural knowledge with their observations, gathering, and reports. It's no wonder, then, that our friend Kathleen Duval, a two-time guest of this show in episodes 37 and 123, calls Cameron's book, Frontiers of Science, mind-blowing. As you can imagine, research like Cameron's takes a long time, and putting it into historical context and crafting a book from it all takes even longer. It also takes a team. And that's what the Omohundro Institute provided Cameron, a team of editors and scholars dedicated to helping him write the best book he could. And now, thanks to the Omohundro Institute and its publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press, you can enjoy the fruits of this team effort at a 40% discount. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/science and use promo code 01BFW, and you'll save 40% off the cover price. Again, save 40% off your very own copy of Frontiers of Science by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/science and using promo code 01BFW. Cameron, a couple of times you've talked about the astronomical survey Spain and the United States conducted to try and establish a boundary between their territorial claims. Would you tell us more about that expedition?
Sure. So it came about after a treaty in 1795 that there'd be this boundary run along the 31st parallel separating Spanish West Florida and East Florida from the southeastern United States. And this was very much an imperial expedition for the United States. This was adding territory to the country at the expense of Spanish America, the first of many times that this would happen, of course. And it was one where astronomers in the United States very much saw this as a kind of test case of how to do astronomy in the service of expansion. Part of this had to do with the actual labor itself. I mentioned before the use of enslaved laborers was very much something that the U.S. astronomer Andrew Ellicott pushed onto the expedition, but also in terms of the observatory space that they used. And Ellicott designed this temporary observatory, basically a tent with observation holes in it, that he hoped would allow him to do these disciplined, exact astronomical observations despite being so far basically in the middle of nowhere in this really hostile environment with mosquitoes, hazy skies, and lots of native people and Spaniards who are out to get them. And this ultimately fails. Not only the experimental observatory, but the expedition itself, it never gets completed because the United States simply doesn't have the power on the ground to overwhelm armed native resistance to it, which the Creeks and Seminoles ultimately put together near the end of the expedition. I mean, I think it's instructive in the sense that we often tend to think that science facilitates imperialism. And I think that's true in many cases. But I think what is in a lot of ways more interesting in the case of the United States and so often overlooked is that imperialism was a kind of pre-existing condition that made scientific practice the way it was, and also made some kind of scientific practices impossible, that these kind of power relations that they hoped to impose on the region, on groups like the Greeks, they weren't a reality. And the astronomical expedition didn't make them more powerful in the region. It actually proved their weakness in the region.
Okay, but if the people involved in this expedition hadn't met with resistance from the Creek and Seminoles, and they had been able to make their observations, how would this astronomy have worked? How exactly do you map a territorial boundary by the stars?
So it's meridian astronomy or geodetic surveying, that basically the idea is you lie on your back with an instrument that is pointing straight up, and you make very careful observations about when specific stars and heavenly bodies pass over the zenith. And by making those observations and then checking them with these books called ephemerides that list all of these celestial events and give a kind of reference to a zero meridian, at Greenwich being the most usual one, they're able to use various mathematical equations and figure out their longitude, which is tougher to determine than latitude based on observations. So basically, they set up a big expedition. In this case, it was a joint expedition with Spanish astronomers, U.S. astronomers, Spanish soldiers, U.S. soldiers, and they had a big team of largely enslaved laborers to cut down big swaths of trees so that they could, make these observations clearly in the sky. The Spanish astronomer and the U.S. astronomer would both make them. They'd compare the results, and they'd both make calculations, and then they'd sort of negotiate on, okay, this is precisely the latitude and longitude at this point. And so they try to run this along a line of latitude, along the 31st line. It takes them well over 2 years of this expedition, and as I mentioned, it ultimately was stopped in northern Florida. But yeah, it is something that's often overlooked, I think, that we talk a lot about cartography and imperialism and this sort of thing, but we often ignore the fact that these maps often depended on intensive, ongoing astronomical observations. And astronomy was the big science of the early 1800s because it was the science that could actually lead to exact, precise mapping in this sense.
It's interesting because we've talked about how imperialism often went hand in hand with science, and you would think that imperialism might further science. But in the examples that we've discussed, this astronomy expedition and the earlier mineral expedition with a monster lizard, it really sounds like imperialism and political relations stymied the pursuit of science. Neither of these expeditions was allowed to finish. So I wonder if you came across any examples in your research where science actually furthered imperialism and where imperialism really allowed science to flourish.
Yes. So I'd say cartography is the most obvious example here. And in the early 1700s, and the first era of really intense imperial competition for the Gulf South, when France, Spain, Britain were all trying to seek and establish and legitimize claims to this region, cartography became a really vital tool for this, that each empire started to produce its own maps of the region and circulate these as a way to stake their claims at each other's expense. But these depended very much on the same kind of imperial encounters on the ground, especially violence. Like one of the most significant of these maps, one published in 1711, came out of the observations of a guy who was involved with the Indian slave trade throughout Florida and Louisiana, who made a lot of the observations he made of the Florida Panhandle and the Mississippi Valley while raiding or trading Indian slaves. So, the actual physical military power, right, to invade these regions and not be stopped in them, right, not be driven out, that made the kind of on-the-ground observations possible. So, again, science is not some kind of detached thing here. It's very much caught up with this Indian slave trade that was really the driving engine of British imperialism in the Deep South in the early 1700s.
Now, it seemed from your book, Frontiers of Science, that science also had another imperial power, which is that it could help define who could belong to an imperial power. So I wonder if you would illustrate this point for us by telling us the story of Thomas Power and William Dunbar, two men who participated in the astronomical expedition we just discussed, and two men who seemed to have rather ambiguous national identities, which really impacted their pursuit of science. So, would you tell us the story of Thomas Power and William Dunbar?
Sure. So Thomas Power and William Dunbar were both people who migrated to the Gulf South in the late 1700s and pursued science along with a lot of other sort of geopolitical schemes, really. And I'll get into the details about them in a second, but I want to point out that these guys are significant in my mind because including individuals like this, these guys with kind of ambiguous, flexible identities and allegiances who were legion in the borderland regions of the United States. I think by including them, it creates a very different picture of the early American scientific community. We've almost entirely defined this as something that early American scientists were brought together by their shared patriotism, their shared engagement with democracy. But once you get into the borderlands, this kind of characterization breaks down really fast, that you have these, very educated engagement of science whose goals, in the case of Thomas Power, is to directly prevent U.S. expansion, and in the case of William Dunbar, to make himself as filthy rich as possible by making his allegiance between Spain and the United States. So Thomas Power was most well known as a spy, and he really combined spying and scientific observation in hopes of strengthening the Spanish Empire and getting the new western states of the United States, places like Tennessee and Kentucky, to secede and thus weaken U.S. expansion and protect New Spain from the United States. And I'd say that, despite the fact that he did spend much of his life engaged in what would easily be considered scientific research and astronomy, botany, all of these things, he's not been remembered at all by history simply because he doesn't fit at all within these usual images we have of who and what should matter. He was allied against the United States, which has seemed to be anathema to history of U.S. science, right? So he's been excluded from that. And his identity as a spy really ended up eclipsing his identity as a man of science, even though in his mind, I think these really went hand in hand. For William Dunbar, the case was really quite different. He achieved huge recognition at the time and really since as the preeminent scientific mind in the region. And I think he was able to accomplish this for a couple reasons. One, that is he was able to leverage his power over slaves. He was a big slave owner, big planter, and use this to acquire scientific instruments, scientific positions too, such as the astronomer for Spain during this boundary survey. And I think he was ultimately able to create a reputation within the United States because he struck up this friendship with Thomas Jefferson and not only corresponded with him about all kinds of natural history and astronomical affairs. For example, in collaboration, they created a method by which a single observer could take accurate longitude observations. This kind of astronomical method meant specifically for U.S. explorers in the West, right? But Dunbar was also able to really teach Jefferson how local experts could and would support science and expansion in an empire. That Dunbar had been doing this under Spain for years before the United States took over his home in Natchez. And he was able to bring this expertise and really the same kind of language he'd used to define relationships with Spanish officials. He translates directly to using with Jefferson, and really from the borderlands outwards, able to define the kinds of relationships, pay, and sort of social engagement between these frontier naturalists and these metropolitan experts. So this was not just the United States exporting how it's going to do science and empire. This is them learning from individuals on the ground who had experience doing this with the Spanish Empire.
As you discussed the work of Thomas Power and William Dunbar as local scientific experts, I couldn't help but think about the fact that we're talking about men who practice science on the edges of empire. And when we think about science in this period, we really tend to think about formal scientific communities or hubs at the centers of empires. So places like the Royal Societies of England and France, the medical community in Leyda, and even Philadelphia. So I wonder how local experts like Power and Dunbar, who use science to help expand and govern imperial territories at the outer edges of empire, fit into these more formal scientific communities at the centers of empire. Did members of these scientific hubs even consider the work of these local experts to be science?
So I'd say a couple things are going on there. That first and foremost, I'd say guys like Dunbar weren't particularly interested in getting the United States to expand. So that was sort of secondary. Their main goal was raising their own reputations, raising their own status, making sure that they had, more wealth, more power, more land. And they recognized that building relationships with leading officials and leading institutions in the United States could make that possible. So guys like Dunbar very much try to create connections with scientific institutions like the American Philosophical Society. Dunbar gets elected as an honorary member. He sends them astronomical observations. He sends them specimens and lists of animals, all kinds of different things. All of this same kind of data, right, that metropolitan scientific institutions had long expected from the colonies. So what I find really interesting that's going on here is that in this moment after independence, guys in the borderlands like Dunbar and people in especially Philadelphia scientific institutions are using each other to create new scientific identities and reputations. That during the colonial eras, men of science in places like Philadelphia very much were seen as colonial collectors who were supposed to be providing data and specimens to, say, the Royal Society in London. But after independence, these institutions like the APS start very much to see themselves as the new metropolitan imperial scientific institution of this new expanding United States empire. And guys like Dunbar make them really happy because all of a sudden they are now playing the role of organizer of knowledge, compiler of knowledge, analyzer, instead of supplier. So guys like Dunbar are able to raise their status by attachment to these scientific institutions, and these institutions are able to construct new senses of what they are more befitting of an independent empire, thanks to having these kind of long distance correspondence from men of science like Dunbar.
And of course, the quest to see the United States as a real place of science wasn't just limited to individual Americans or scientific communities. It really seemed to be a national project. And to this end, I wonder if you would tell us about the United States' engagement in the Seminole Wars. These were wars that took place in Florida between 1817 and 1858, and I think they're a really interesting case study where the government really attempted to use military expeditions to accomplish two imperial aims. One was territorial expansion via Indian removal, and the other was scientific, in that the United States really wanted natural knowledge of this region of Florida.
The one I focus on most in the book is the Second Seminole War, which is the longest of these Seminole Wars. It lasted from 1835 to 1842, and it was also the longest and most expensive of any war between the United States and an Indian group. And the point I make about these being both military and scientific expeditions is that prior to the Second Seminole War, men of science in the United States knew very, very little about the interior of Florida. We think of it as this very rich ecosystem of Everglades and all kinds of exotic animals and plants. But since the United States simply didn't have much power in this region before the war, that the Seminoles really called the shots throughout the peninsula, and it could often be a matter of life or death to do exploration in a place where you simply didn't have the armed backing to, say, study plants without worrying about getting killed. And the Second Seminole War, all of a sudden, there's this invasion of thousands of Anglo-Americans into Florida. And a lot of these men are deeply interested in collecting, writing about, publishing, circulating on the natural history and geography of Florida. Some of these are military officers, militia officers, army officers who spend their spare time either collecting plants or collecting skulls of Seminole individuals and using these again to kind of build their own reputations as educated elites in some ways. And also the more specialized naturalists were also able to accompany these expeditions. But at the same time, things hadn't changed all that much in the Gulf South, or at least in the still contested parts of the Gulf South, like Florida, that native power on the ground could still not only prevent Euro-Americans from studying what they wanted to study, but they could make it cost their lives to even try to do so. That power still wasn't completely in the hands of Anglo-Americans, and it still remained very risky. And several naturalists who were trying to take advantage of military escorts during the war to, make maps to collect plants, ended up getting killed by Seminoles and all their work being lost. Yeah, it still very much remained a situation in which imperial expansion and the violence that came with it made this new wave of observation possible, but it also led to violence and resistance that could mean death or at least lost work on the hands of men of science.
Now, in Cameron's book, Frontiers of Science, Cameron not only shows us how natural knowledge developed and circulated amid all these ongoing encounters and unequal power relations, he also shows us how this knowledge creation and circulation fueled the creation of the Smithsonian. Cameron, would you tell us about the origins and early days of the Smithsonian and how they fit into this broader picture you've painted for us of science in early America?
Absolutely. So in the epilogue of the book, I actually shift gears from talking about the southeast borderlands and looking at the southwest borderlands. And in the years during and right after the U.S.-Mexican War, basically making the point that just after the United States finally conquers this region, the southeast, at the end of the Second Seminole War in 1842, just a few years later, they set their sights on conquering this enormous new borderland in the West. And the process of conquering, expanding into, and studying this region really looks almost identical to it the way it did in the southeast before this, that as in the Second Seminole War, it depends heavily on the military. It depends on conquest and subduing groups that could, either upset scientific expeditions or kill the expeditionaries. And what's really fascinating about this, though, is that at the same moment, 1846, when the United States begins war with Mexico, it's also the first year of the Smithsonian Institution, which very quickly emerges in Washington as the premier scientific center of the United States. And the point I make in the epilogue is that the way that the Smithsonian develops is tied directly to this ongoing campaign of U.S. expansion in the West and also really throughout the world as U.S. scientists start to go to Peru, start to go to the Pacific, and start to get funded in these ventures by the Smithsonian, start to send their specimens to the Smithsonian. So the point here is that while the development of the Smithsonian is usually seen as this kind of watershed in the history of American science, and that the conquest of the West is usually seen as this watershed in the history of U.S. expansion, I make the point that these are really just more of the same in a lot of ways. It's the same kind of interrelated processes of knowledge production and territorial expansion that have been going on really since Ponce de Leon set foot in Florida in the early 1500s, that knowledge production takes place in this context of imperialism, and imperialism affects the ways that knowledge is pursued, the kinds of knowledge is pursued, and how sometimes knowledge is not able to be produced.
Do you think this tradition of science and imperialism going hand in hand has carried forth into our own present day? Do you think they still go together?
I say absolutely. And I think it's most obvious in terms of patronage and funding, that starting with the end of the Second World War, really, and the rise of the Cold War, there's an extreme intensification of the relationship between the military, especially military funding, and the work of scientists. And I hope to have made the point in the book that this is something that emerged earlier in the United States in the Second Seminole War and the conquest of the West. But it really does take on a new kind of scope after World War II, when the federal government's throwing millions and billions of dollars at scientists to, say, develop new weapons, develop new oceanic study techniques to facilitate submarine warfare, this kind of thing. And if there's one thing that historians of science agree on, it's that patronage, who pays you to do scientific work, matters to the kind of scientific work you do. And I think the fact that military funding has been so instrumental to not only weapons production and stuff, but basic research and things like physics and math for the last many, many decades, I think very much plays into this idea that ongoing competitions, and those engendered really by U.S. expansion and ongoing informal and formal U.S. imperialism overseas, these continue to really condition how knowledge is made. The violence created by this, and the violence in weaponry and this kind of thing, continues to condition how knowledge is made. So I think in a lot of ways that this context of imperialism really is the constant that you can use to trace a long history of not only science, but a long kind of intellectual history of America that goes deep into the colonial era and really deep into the 20th century and beyond.
We should move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Cameron, in your opinion, what might have happened if Europeans, Americans, Native Americans, and Africans had lacked scientific and natural knowledge? How would the history of North America, the Gulf Coast, and relations between all these different groups have been different?
It's a really kind of weird mind exercise to imagine what it would be like to be a person alive without any knowledge of the natural world, right? To have no idea that particular metal is worth something for some reason in your mind, right? Or to be able to identify that metal as valuable, to identify that tree as valuable, to be able to draw the maps that actually claim space. I'd say that one of the most profound ways it would change things, if none of these folks had any kind of concept of natural knowledge, is that the competitions and power hierarchies would take really different forms, because the sort of construction of racial difference was so inextricable to the imperial project, both before and after the United States. And this is, very much a product of natural knowledge, both in the case of U.S. scientists looking at other races and, say, natives analyzing ethnic difference as well. And if everyone kind of saw themselves as biologically the same and didn't look at things like racial difference, that would make the world extremely different, because the hierarchies, they would probably still exist, but they take different forms. A class may have become a much more pronounced source of difference instead of skin color, say. And also the competitions themselves, right? Like, imagine competing for a continent in which no one had or made maps saying what their claims were. It would be a very chaotic, even more chaotic moment of no one even really knowing what they were claiming, and the whole sort of concept of what a territorial claim is without a map, without surveyed boundaries, right? Very kind of difficult to fathom. I like this question because the difficulty of answering it really drives home just how inextricable these various kinds of natural knowledge are from conceptions of not only imperial society, but any society in general, I think.
So now that you've explored the frontiers of early American science, what are you researching now?
My second book project's on Native American explorers. And this obviously builds a bit off of frontiers of science and looking at how individuals study the natural world. But I'm looking specifically at Eastern natives who explored the West, the region west of the Mississippi, mostly in the 1700s and 1800s. And what I see as the really interesting aspect of this is that it turns this really old trope of exploration and empire on its head. That, if we know anything about exploration, it's usually that, well, exploration facilitates empire. When we look at non-European explorers, though, I think that relationship is very different. It's that these individuals, these natives I'm looking at, they explore as a creative response to imperialism, that as they're driven from their homes or escaping disease or escaping warfare, they start to look for new alliances, new lands, new resources in the West as a way to make their lives better. So I'd say that the story we have now about exploration and empire is really only half of the story, right? That the other half of the story, and I'd say maybe even far more than half of the story, is how Native Americans, folks in Africa, folks in Asia, folks in Australia, all set about their own waves of exploration as a result of the impact of imperialism on their homelands.
And what are the best ways to contact you, Cameron, if we have more questions about science and natural knowledge in early America?
Sure, I'd be very happy to receive any communiques. The easiest way is probably to go to my department website through the University of Nevada, Reno. And my name is Cameron Strang, of course. And my email is cstrang@unr.edu if anyone would like to reach out that way. And I'd be more than happy to discuss any aspect of any of this.
Cameron Strang, Thank you for guiding us through the Gulf South borderlands and for helping us better understand the connections between imperialism and knowledge production in early America.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Natural knowledge refers to the knowledge human beings produce about the natural world. It's what we know about plants, animals, peoples, land, seas, and stars, and how they all operate. Just like us, early Americans wanted to know more about the world around them. The knowledge they produced about this world was often the product of individuals making keen observations and conducting systematic experiments. It was also the product of cultural encounters, many of which were made possible by the forces of imperialism. Imperialism and science went hand in hand in early America. Different empires wanted to lay claims to different lands and peoples, and in order for them to turn their desires for expansion into a reality, they actually had to learn something about the different lands, peoples, and resources they sought to rule over. So empires sent expeditions. Expeditions to investigate and report on the topography, minerals, soils, and peoples of the new lands they desired, and in turn, other empires sent expeditions to stop the explorers of competing empires. As Cameron related in the stories of Yawalichi and the Spanish Search for Silver, the joint Spanish-United States astronomical expedition to establish an exact boundary between the United States and Spanish Florida, and of the United States' joint military and scientific expedition during the Second Seminole War, we can really see how empires sent expeditions to acquire both land and knowledge, and how other empires sometimes sent expeditions to stop them. We can also see how imperialism both fueled and stymied the pursuit of scientific and natural knowledge. And as Cameron noted, this connection between imperialism and science, well, this is something that continues into our present day. Governments in the United States and abroad regularly fund the pursuit of new technologies and knowledge because they believe those technologies and knowledge will better their people and further their political ends. Which I guess proves that old adage that knowledge is power, or at least that knowledge can be power. Look for more information about Cameron, his book, Frontiers of Science, plus a link to his Google Talks video about his book on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/251. If you found today's conversation fascinating, why not go deeper? Cameron covers all of the case studies we talked about today and presents several other case studies we didn't talk about in his book, Frontiers of Science. The Omohundro Institute and its publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press, are offering Cameron's book at a 40% discount. So why not take advantage of this great deal by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/science and using promo code 01BFW. Thank you for telling your friends about Ben Franklin's World, and please keep up the good work by telling more of your friends and family about the show. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Emily Sneff, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, speaking of knowledge, I'm curious why you're interested in learning more about history. What is it that you seek from the past? What does knowledge about history add to your life? These are questions that I've been thinking about for myself, and I really wonder what your answers are, so please share them with me. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.